We began last week looking at the very, very practical side of developing or setting yourself up for an implementation and a usefulness of these tools that you have access to, called the biblical appeal. And I made mention a couple of weeks ago that sometimes knowing how to make a biblical appeal and having the tools, if you would, of making a biblical appeal is very similar to someone who's just been handed a loaded revolver and you've never shot one before, or you've just been handed a double-barrel shotgun, and it's an old-fashioned one and both hammers are back, and you've never shot one before, and someone has just handed it to you. And if you're not really, really careful, you could be monkeying around and accidentally pull the trigger. There is a pastor in Phoenix who's a big guy with a full beard, and I can't remember, and he has a YouTube channel called Active Self-Protection. And what he does is he puts out about a 3-minute YouTube video to help people understand about how to behave in certain crisis situations. Frequently, somebody's getting gas, and some nut job comes up and decides he wants all your money, and he sticks a gun in your face. Somebody is at a 7-Eleven or a fast food place, and a couple of clowns walk up and they start waving, hardware around, and they want your money, and they don't realize that people who go to 7-Eleven by definition don't have very much money. People who go to McDonald's by definition don't have very much money. Boy, if you had money, you wouldn't go to a McDonald's. If you had money, you wouldn't go to a 7-Eleven, okay? And these clowns never bothered to take note of what kind of cars are there, okay? That guy doesn't have any money, 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 that guy owes a lot of money. But anyway, one of the things that he showed was frequently he shows YouTube videos from Brazil and Argentina, sometimes from the Dominican Republic, Jamaica, places like it, a lot of crime. And one of them was a security guard that had been hired, I think, by a jeweler, and his job was to maintain surveillance on the facility. And in one of them, the security guard, of course, had his face buried in a smartphone. Okay? Some people are going to miss the rapture because their faces are going to be buried in a smartphone, and the Lord is going to sound the trumpet and say, "Look up," and they don't know how to do that. They're busy doing this, and they're going to get left behind. So 2 guys walk into the shop with guns out through a revolving door. They get all the way inside. The guy doesn't notice them because he's got his face buried in a smartphone. That's almost as ridiculous as a guy going on vacation and he's with the family sitting around the table, and while everybody is socializing, he's got his face buried in a smartphone. You fly 1,000 miles to visit folks, and you insult them by burying your face in a smartphone instead of interacting with them. Okay, that's another issue besides. But another situation was a security guard who was standing outside of a small shop, and he had a weapon, and he kept playing with it. Okay, when a guy has he's got open carry, and he's a security guard, an armed security guard. Obviously, if it's a semi-automatic weapon, there ought to be one in the tube. There's no point in carrying a firearm if it's not loaded and ready to go, because the amount of time, and he shows videos on guys who had a pistol that they didn't have around chambered, and as they were doing this, they were being killed. He's probably got about 50 of them where a guy slaps the letter, pulls it out, and as he's chambering around, he's getting killed. Okay, but this guy had a round in the chamber, and he's monkeying around, touching it and grabbing it and feeling it and doing all that kind of stuff, and he shoots himself. because he's messing with it, okay? And he's got a dangerous weapon in his possession, and he doesn't realize that most of the danger to him from his dangerous weapon is the unconscious, inadvertent use of it, okay? Now, if he's thinking, and if he's focused, and if he's determined, he'll be quite safe, because he's going to go according to the rules that he's been taught. It's when he's not paying attention, it's when he's not focused, it's when he's not concentrating that he is not only a danger to himself, but also to everyone else. How many of you have seen the YouTube video of a police officer standing in front of a grade school classroom, and he's telling the boys and girls, this is my firearm, and police officers carry firearm, but we are well trained how to bang. Oh, 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 and he shot himself in the foot in front of a school classroom. When my wife and I were back in school preparing for the ministry, I used to work as a security guard for Fazio's Shopping Bag. Some of you may remember that chain. It was basically there was a grocery war against the Italian mafia versus the Mormon mafia, and the Mormon mafia beat the Italian mafia. They actually went into a meeting, and they had their consigliere, and they had all of their security. I was there at the building where they had basically these guys coming in limos, and they sat down, and they weren't going to leave until one of them had bought the other one out. And the meeting ran about 36 hours, and the guys from Boise had more money than the Don from Cleveland. And so Fazio's Shopping Bag got bought out by Albertsons. Well, anyway, these guys were crazy in the way they handle firearms, and it just goes to show you that you got to be careful when someone has handed you a very useful tool. You need to be careful, okay? And what I have done for the last 25 consecutive Wednesday nights is I've handed you a very, very sharp katana, okay? Anybody know what that is? That's a Japanese samurai sword, okay? It's a very sharp blade. Boy, you can do a lot of good, and you can do a lot of harm. When my family moved from Florida up to Central Oregon, when my dad basically broke his word to us and took us back on another Indian reservation from Fort Lauderdale, Florida. Who would want to leave Fort Lauderdale, Florida? I mean, wow, that's where the boys are. Anyway, so we find ourselves on an Indian reservation out in the middle of Central Oregon. There's nothing there. There's absolutely nothing there. I mean, we're a bus ride away from the beach. We're a bus ride away from, we're a couple of hundred yards from the intercoastal waterway and canals and catching snakes and lizards and doing all this kind of cool stuff to a barren wasteland in eastern Oregon. Anyway, so the first day that my dad reported for his assignment as the superintendent of the Warm Springs Reservation, I decided to walk over to his office with him. And as he's sitting down and trying to, leave an imprint on his staff that were goofing off because he showed up a week early. They weren't expecting the new big dog to show up for another week. He showed up a week early. And they're all, their feet are up on the desk, and they're smoking cigars, and they're monkeying around and flirting with the secretaries when my dad walks in. And, yeah, who are you? The question is, who are you? And that's how he introduced himself. Well, I'm snooping around in his office while he's doing all this stuff, and I found that somebody had left a Japanese samurai sword in his walk-in closet off of his office. So I said, "Can I have it?" He said, "Sure, it's yours." "Great, it's mine. I now have a Japanese samurai sword." But like everything that is owned by the oldest brother, the younger brother messes with it. I had a motorcycle that my brother messed with. I had another motorcycle that my brother messed with. I had a Japanese samurai sword that my brother messed with. Only when my brother is about 2 o'clock in the morning with his best friend messing around in his bedroom, and they're doing this kind of stuff, his best friend, who is now retired from the military in Phoenix, he does a lunge, and he runs that thing into my brother's knee about 2 inches in. Did I say that katanas were very, 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 very sharp? You can shave with them, ladies. Guys can too, actually. It's a little more difficult getting the knife, around the neck. But my brother and his best friend attempted for about an hour and a half to staunch the blood flow, and it was, there wasn't huge volumes of blood, but it wouldn't stop. My brother went through about 14, 16 large terry cloth bath towels, absolutely soaked with blood. He couldn't get it to stop. And finally, he walks, he's faint, and he knocks on my parents' bedroom door, and then he collapses, and my dad calls the ambulance. Well, I serve to illustrate that you can have a very effective and a wonderful tool at your disposal if you know how to use it. He didn't, and his friend didn't. So last Wednesday night, I began talking to you about how to make use of this tool called a biblical appeal. Can you cause a lot of damage? You can. Can you irreparably harm relationships? You can. But is it an effective tool? Yes. Remember, the same cutthroat razor that you use to shave yourself, guys, if you're a real man and shave with a real razor, can also be used to cut somebody's throat as they're sitting in a barber chair. Depends on how you use it. And the same thing is true of a biblical appeal. Last time, I talked about a government official, someone who has an unassailable position in your life that you make an appeal to. Boy, you can mess yourself up, okay? Or you can accomplish a great deal. Tonight, I want to shift gears just a little bit, and I want to talk to you about how to make an appeal to me or to a pastor, okay? So make your way to 1 Timothy chapter 5. This is the first of what seemed to me to be 2 chapters in the New Testament that provide particular insight for church members in their dealings with their pastors. Which, of course, begs the question, first of all, a person should be a Christian. Secondly, a person should have a pastor. How do you get a pastor? I remember one time, a long time ago, a woman, while I was on vacation, decided to attend a church, and she made a profession of faith, and she got baptized at the church, became a member of the church after she'd been coming here for a couple of years. And when I got back, about 4 weeks after she had done this, she called me up and said, can I have an appointment? And I said, why? And she said, so I can seek your counsel. And I said, no. And she said, why not? I said, you have a pastor. And it's not me. And she began to cry. I said, I don't know why you're crying. You should be crying to your pastor. If you're not a member of Calvary Road Baptist Church, I'm delighted to preach to you. I'm delighted to teach you. I'm delighted to actually answer questions that you have. But if you're not a member of Calvary Road Baptist Church, I'm not your pastor. When a person becomes a member of a church, they enter into a relationship with that ministry and have established at that point a relationship with the church and those involved in ministry leadership of that church, such as pastors, okay? If you go to Matthew chapter 18, where it says, If your brother trespass against thee, go and tell him his fault between thee and him alone. If he hears thee, you've gained your brother. If not, take with thee one or two, that in the mouth of two or three every word may be established. And if he still won't hear you, then you take it to the church. That entire passage only works if you're a church member. It has absolutely no applicability to a Christian going to another Christian at work and trying to take him into task over what he thinks he's done wrong to him. Now, you can go ahead and do it if you want to, but there's no biblical leverage involved. There's no Matthew chapter 18 backing you up when you're doing that, okay? Because it actually applies to church members only. When the Apostle Paul talks about that kind of thing in 1 Corinthians chapter 6, he's talking to church members about things that church members deal with each other, okay? So, let's say that you're a Christian. Let's say you're a member of Calvary Road Baptist Church, and therefore I'm your pastor. I'm about to tell you how to deal with me making use of this very wicked sharp blade known as a katana, okay? That you can either solve a problem or you can leave my blood on the floor, okay? 1 Timothy chapter 5, and then we'll go to 1 Peter chapter 5. In 1 Timothy chapter 5, look at verses 19 and 20 with me. There we find direction for dealing with a spiritual leader someone seeks to level an accusation against. Well, what does this let us know? This lets us know that from time to time spiritual leaders commit sins and people need to take them to task for those. Okay? Or for making an unwise decision. Maybe the pastor hasn't committed an outright sin, but he's made a decision that you consider is foolhardy or unwise. Okay? Maybe the pastor has used the building fund to purchase for him a brand new Bentley. And you think that that's just somewhat out of bounds for what a pastor ought to be doing with building fund money. But notice what it says, beginning with verse 19, against an elder, receive not an accusation, but before 2 or 3 witnesses. This doesn't tell you you can't approach a spiritual leader with an accusation. It just very sharply prescribes how you are to do so, okay, within defined limits. Them that sin, in other words, if it turns out the guy really is in the wrong, rebuke before all, that others also may fear. I am of the opinion that one of the most serious problems of Christendom in the 21st century is because it's pastors who frequently occupy unassailable positions, and people do not feel like they have the ability to approach a pastor and take him to task for a sin he's committed or an unwise decision he's made. You see, well, what makes you say that? How many church members do you think would sit still for their pastor buying a brand new Gulfstream $60 million jet? And yet there are dozens of ministries all across the United States where the pastors have $60 million jets at their disposal that they fly around in once or twice a week. You honestly believe they could get away with that kind of nonsense if members of the church had access to them, one, and could hold them accountable, two? I don't think so. I think that kind of conduct is testimony to the fact that those guys are not accessible, nor are they accountable. And yet the Bible specifically shows that spiritual leaders are supposed to be both accessible and accountable. Okay? Now understand, these 2 verses do not speak directly to appealing to a pastor. That being obvious, that being so, it's obvious that one who can be accused of wrongdoing is also someone who a well-intentioned church member would or could or should make an appeal to before the problem gets to be so large that an accusation is necessary. Okay? Where someone approaches a pastor and says, "Pastor, I need to ask you a question. Yeah. Do you really think that this direction that you're going is the right way to go? And that kind of a question can be asked way before a pastor has actually done something sinful. Because usually when you do something sinful, you start heading in that direction long before you actually do it. Okay? I promise you, when a guy cheats on his wife, he didn't just fall into that. Oh, no. He was thinking about that and moving in that direction and beginning to cut off from other people access to how he spends his private time days, weeks, months before he decides he's going to cheat on. He's decided what he's going to do long before he does it. Okay? Same thing is true of a businessman who is doing things that are inappropriate, and yet the board of directors is afraid to say anything because he's been so successful in the past. They don't want to make him mad in the future. I'm guessing that the guy was recently deposed from Uber. Some guys allowed him to do some dangerously dumb things for the past year or so, and it got so bad they just finally had to let him go. And he was the guy who thought up Uber. They went from 0 to $50 billion in valuation before they had earned a penny profit. Okay? Say, well, how did they let him get away with stuff? It's because he was so wildly successful they didn't hold him accountable. And so when they finally did hold him accountable, they jerked his chain and fired him, which was apparently an appropriate thing to do. So, now turn, if you would, please, to 1 Peter chapter 5. 1 Peter chapter 5, verses 2 and 3. Here we are provided insight from a somewhat different perspective. Notice what it says, beginning with verse 2 of 1 Peter chapter 5. Feed the flock of God which is among you, taking the oversight thereof, not by constraint. That word constraint means coercion. It means force. It means you don't make anybody do anything, but willingly, not for filthy lucre, but of a ready mind, neither as being lords over God's heritage, but being ensamples to the flock. Whereas the Apostle Paul's directive to Timothy provides guidance for someone who takes issue with something a pastor has said or done, this passage, a little bit different perspective, reminds spiritual leaders that no one is authorized to compel any member of the congregation to do anything. No one. How many of you have ever been aware of a church dynamic in which the pastor actually made someone do something they just flat did not want to do? Anybody ever have that kind of experience? Maybe not to you, but you observed it. It's not appropriate. It's not appropriate. Okay. Rather, leadership is to be accompanied by means of instruction and example. Thus, by implication, the door is left open for members to make appeals to those who feed the flock of God. Has anybody ever heard me make the comment about where the ultimate democracy is to be found in our culture? Church is the ultimate democracy. You vote with your feet. You vote every time you come, and you vote every time you stay home. You vote every time you don't come. And no one can make you. No one should make you. You say, well, what about kids? Guys, the Bible says, forsake not the law of thy mother. Your mothers are supposed to make you, and you're supposed to do what they tell you to do, and if you're not willing to do it, what should they do to you, Ed? They should kick you out in the street, right? And long before they kick you out in the street, you ought to be man enough to pack your bags and leave voluntarily so she doesn't have to kick you out. You're not going to do what your mom says. You need to leave. Am I wrong? Does that sound harsh? No. Excuse me, that's the arrangement between children and parents. But other than children with their parents, when it comes to church, you say, yeah, no, I don't want to go to church. You have to go to church. I don't want to go to church. You have to go to church. Or let's put it this way. If you want to stay in this house, you have to go to church. You don't have to go to church. But then again, you don't have to stay here either. Congratulations, son. You're now a man, able to make up his own mind and choose his own way of life. Of course, you're going to be expected to pay your own rent and buy your own gas and buy your own clothes and all that kind of stuff. You ready for that, boy? Well, I don't know. Well, then do what I tell you until you're ready for that. Okay? Just do what I tell you until you're ready for that. But in a church, nobody has any business. So all you have to do is say, I don't really want to do that. Okay. Okay. Somebody's involved in a ministry and they say, I just don't want to do that anymore. Oh, okay. I've been here 32 years, and I've had lots of people approach me and say, I don't want to involve myself in that ministry anymore. And the answer they hear every single time is, okay. With the exception of Ken Barbosa. Right? Are you glad I tried to talk you out of it? Yes. Good. Praise God. Put you on the spot, though, didn't I? Sorry about that. Yeah, I may try to persuade you, make an appeal to you, but ultimately you don't have to do anything you don't want to do. And the whole concept of freedom of choice, soul liberty, that didn't come from the Constitution of the United States. Do you know where Madison got the concept? He got the concept from the Baptist churches in the colony of Virginia. Because it existed nowhere else in the world. In the world. Didn't exist in any of the denominations of Europe or the United Kingdom. Except for just a small group of Baptists there. I mean, it simply did not dawn on people that people have a right to do what they want to do until a certain sect began to point it out that that's found in the Bible. Okay. So, the door is left open for members to make appeals to those who feed the flock of God. Now, go back to 1 Timothy 5:17 if you would, because what must be kept in mind by way of caution, because remember, you're wielding this very sharp sword, is the importance, according to the Bible, of honoring God's men. This caution, given 2 verses before, warning that accusations without witnesses are not to be entertained. It's dishonoring to someone to entertain an accusation against him without corroboration. You dishonor him. Now, you can appeal to him, but you must do so without dishonoring him. In other words, you appeal to him in a respectful manner. You can accuse him in a respectful manner. Well, obviously, if you're to accuse the guy in a respectful manner, you should appeal to the guy in a respectful manner, arguing from lesser to greater. Okay. Now, go back to 1 Peter chapter 5, verses 5 and 6. We see there stressed the importance of humility when dealing with spiritual leaders. So every church member should recognize the propriety of appealing to a pastor. You should be willing to do that. You should be prepared to do that. So long as someone in that position is dealt with in an honorable fashion, treating him respectfully while at the same time exhibiting on your part humility. This is not really different than the approach that should be used with anyone, by the way, is it? I mean, whenever you're appealing to someone, shouldn't you be respectful? Shouldn't you demonstrate humility? Huh? I mean, when a teenage boy makes a biblical appeal to his mom, does he stand there like this and do this to her? I don't think, not at my house that never happened. Get my face slapped, okay? I wonder how often it happened at the Rodarty household. Did it ever happen at the Rodarty household? I didn't think so. I didn't think so. An additional comment I would make with sadness is the accessibility that is frequently missing from many ministries, where the pastor is simply not approachable. A pastor should be within relatively easy reach of church members when they have a serious problem or when they seek to influence their pastor. And by the way, church members should seek to influence their pastor, to make a new decision or to consider a different direction. They should be willing to do that. Now, if a pastor is not accessible, there's a problem. Turn in your Bible to 2 Samuel chapter 15. If a pastor is not accessible, he sets himself up the way King David did through his own neglect. For one stretch, you know, David had some issues, right? He was a man after God's own heart, but he was a bad dad. I mean, he just was a lousy dad. And not what you'd call the most faithful husband, okay? But for one stretch in his life, David would not see his son Absalom. He wouldn't see him. They live in the same house, in the same palace. But he did not see Absalom for 2 years. And of all of his children, Absalom was the alpha male. He was the big dog among David's sons. He was the prominent one. He was the aggressive one. He was the leader. He was the one that was willing to challenge the boundaries, okay? And that problem of David being an inaccessible father showed up elsewhere in David's reign. I mean, if he's not accessible to his son, then he's likely not accessible to other people also, okay? A guy that's not willing to talk to his wife is usually a guy not willing to talk to other people either, all right? Because we think we compartmentalize our lives, but we really don't do that very well, okay? So I want you to notice how matters deteriorated in the life of David from 2 Samuel chapter 15, beginning with verse 2. And Absalom, now this is after Dad has been unwilling to see him or speak to him for 2 years. He's a grown man. Dad's not willing to talk to him. And Absalom rose up early and stood beside the way of the gate. Now, the way of the gate, that's where all of the business is done in the community. That'd be like City Hall in our culture. And it was so that when any man that had a controversy came to the king for judgment, then Absalom called unto him and said, also when he had a problem to take up with the king, he went to where the king ought to have been, but the king weren't there. Who was there instead of the king? The son the king had paid no attention to for 2 years. You think maybe he had a grievance? Of what city art thou? Absalom would say, oh, he's showing interest. Hey, where are you from? Oh, yeah, I remember when I was there. Yeah, the hamburger stand on the corner is really cool. I really like it, yeah. And he said, thy servant is one of the tribes of Israel. Oh, yeah, we're in this together. Yeah, Mikasa, Sukasa, whatever, you know. Verse 3, and Absalom said unto him, see, thy matters are good and right, but there is no man deputed of the king to hear thee. Oh, yeah, you've got a legitimate grievance, but there's nobody. I wish the king, yeah, he just didn't. Yeah, these bureaucrats, yeah, you know. Verse 4, Absalom said, moreover, oh, that I were made judge in the land. If only I were in charge, I would know what to do. That every man which hath any suit or cause might come unto me, and I would do him justice. Absalom's running for office in a government that doesn't have elections. And it was so that when any man came nigh to him to do him obeisance, he put forth his hand and took him and kissed him. Oh, yeah. See, when he needs these people, he will embrace them and give them a hug and kiss them on each cheek. This is the guy who grew up in the king's palace and didn't get within 50 feet of normal people under most circumstances. Verse 6, and on this manner did Absalom to all Israel that came to the king for judgment. So Absalom stole the hearts of the men of Israel. And of course, you know the story. You've read through it before. Absalom went on to rebel against his father. David had to run for his life. But this episode serves to illustrate the danger to anyone whose failure to provide access and approachability cuts off people from making appeals that need to be made. Appeals that ought to be considered. Appeals that ought to be acted on. If you do not have my email address, that's your fault. Ask for it. If you do not have my cell phone number, that's your fault. Ask for it. If you want a meeting with me in person, ask for it. I request only that you give me one day off each week to rest and recuperate. If you want to know, you have but to ask. And if you desire that I consider a new decision, you have but to appeal. I promise. I'm sticking my neck out, and you are the one who is holding the sword. I urge you to use it appropriately to accomplish wonderful things. Do you have a question? Yes, sir.
So it looks like, but I know not in your case, it looks like in 1 Timothy it says, as opposed to Matthew 18, one-on-one, it seems to say two or more.
Paul is telling Timothy, by the time you hear about it, somebody should have already gone to that person privately. And when they come to you saying he won't listen, they need to have somebody else with them. So by the time it comes to you, Timothy, you're at stage 2. You follow what I'm saying?
Yeah, what about the instance when the pastor is the person that is being dealt with?
That's the point. Yeah, that's exactly what Paul is talking about with Timothy. Yeah, by the time you hear about it, by the time any elder hears about it, about another elder being approached, by the time you hear about it, I went to Pastor so-and-so and he wouldn't listen. Who's here with you? Well, nobody. I came to you. No, we're not talking about this unless you bring somebody with you. Okay? No, they don't need to necessarily. They get read into the issue at that second stage. Yeah. Anybody else have a question? I hope that addressed your question. Yeah. The problem, let me give you an illustration. Maybe 20 years ago, a friend of mine, I'm sure he's with the Lord by now, named Noah Hutchings. Is this thing on, by the way, Roxanne? Okay. He had a book signing at Roman's bookstore. Prolific author, probably written 40 or 50 books. And he called me up one day and said, I'm in Pasadena, and drop by, got a book signing, great, I'll be there. And he was a wonderful old geezer. He had been on several South Pacific landing assaults, Saipan and different places like that. He is just a venerable veteran of combat in World War II. And by the time I met him, he had, his chest looked like a zipper. He had so many open heart surgeries, and he's, all of this tall, And so I walked up, and he's at a table, and he's signing books furiously, and I gave him one of these, and he stopped what he was doing, and he came over and said, John, you got to do me a favor. You got to do me a favor. I said, sure, what is it? He said, there's a lady here that wants me to counsel her. I can't counsel her. I got 100 people waiting for me to sign their book. And Romans flew me in here, and they set me up. I'm obligated to do what they brought me here to do. Would you talk to her? Okay. And so he took me over to where the lady was sitting, and I introduced myself. And she was a really old woman. She was about as old then as I am now. And so I sat down on a chair beside her, and she started talking, and she said, I have some really severe issues. And I said, can I help you? And she said, please. And she began to talk, and she sounded like a member of our church. Just the way she talked, her jargon, all that. So I stopped her. I said, ma'am, can I ask you a question? She said, yeah. I said, are you a believer? Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I've been a believer in the Lord for many, many years. I said, okay. I said, do you have a pastor? Oh, yeah, I do. I got one of those. I went, great. I said, are you a member of a church? And then she told me what region of Southern California she was from. And I knew who her pastor was, because I've known her pastor for 40 years. And as she began to unload on me, I said, ma'am, you really need to talk to your pastor. This is serious. She said, oh, there's no talking to him. I said, ma'am, I'm really quite sure. She says, oh, no, there's no talking to him. I said, I'm sure that if you called the secretary and said, I really need to talk to the pastor. She said, you don't know how many times I've done that. She said, there's no talking to the pastor. There's no talking to the pastor. No one has access to the pastor. I said, well, if you tell the secretary that this is a very serious personal problem, and she said, oh, no, that's not going to work. She says, this is what happens. I get assigned to some associate pastor right out of school, and some kid who's younger than my grandchildren, and he's like, 22, 23, 24 years old. What does he know? I'm 75 years old. What does he know? He doesn't know anything. And I says, well, ma'am, I'm sure that if you communicate to that young associate pastor that this is a job for, the varsity, she said, I've done that. I've done that. And I said, ma'am, I don't know what you would have me to do. The problem that you are describing is a problem that can only be addressed by the senior pastor of your church. And that's not who I am. So I can't do you any good. I'm sorry. I'm terribly sorry. I said, in my opinion, the only guy at your church who can deal with this problem is the senior pastor. And unless you can get to him, I don't know what you could do. Now, sad to say, this is not an unusual situation. Okay? There are congregations all over the United States of America where the pastor of the church is utterly inaccessible to the members. That's too bad. It's not supposed to be that way, because we see in 1 Peter chapter 5 and in 1 Timothy chapter 5 that that person is a person that you have biblical authority to hold accountable for sins. Well, if you have authority to hold him accountable for sins, you, by implication, have authority to hold him accountable on his way to committing sins. Somewhere between innocent and pure and doing wrong, you don't have to wait until he has hung somebody before you have the authority to talk to him. Okay? So that means you have authority to set me down and speak directly to me with respect to a biblical appeal if you think I'm headed in the wrong direction, even if you don't think I have yet done anything wrong. Okay? That's a crucial matter. So, you say, well, what are some of the dangers? What are some of the drawbacks? Some of the dangers and some of the drawbacks are this. If a pastor is not accessible to a church member, what might a church member then be tempted to do? Is it always Brian? Is he the only one whose mind works? Please, ask a question. Come on, guys. But others of you certainly have to have thoughts along this line. Go ahead. Huh? Some people walk. Some people walk. But not all people walk. What do some people do? Roberta. Yeah, some people stay. Some people walk and then talk. Some people stay and then talk. Nobody doesn't talk. Nobody doesn't talk. Now, it's improper for a Christian who's a member of the church to be tempted to leave the church because he or she can't get any relief. That's inappropriate. That's the pastor's fault. It's also inappropriate for a church member to stay and start going on. Say, well, I don't like the direction that the church is going, and I think we should go in a different direction. And so that person doesn't approach me about the direction of the church or ministry. And, well, let's just say Sunday school. Let's say they got an issue with Sunday school. And by the way, I've gotten several good comments. Monica, you were one of them. Several good comments, constructive criticisms about the development of Sunday school. But let's say somebody has an issue with the way Sunday school is proceeding and the way it's unfolding and the way it's developing, and they don't want to come to me, and they don't want to go to Brother Mike, so they go to Andrew. Really? Really? Does anybody know how old Andrew is? Now, you know that I think well of Andrew. But does anybody know how old he isn't? How old is he, Tony? He's 23 years old. How many of you think he looks 19? Okay. He dresses 25, but he's actually 23. That's inappropriate. Okay. So a pastor should be accessible, not inaccessible, so that if a person has an issue that they want to make a constructive appeal about, that they should have the liberty, the freedom to do that, so that they will not succumb to temptations to do other things, which cause problems. Okay? And you've noticed for the last 3 Sundays in a row, what have Lee Moyer and Rick Raimundo been urging people to do? They have rehearsed in the announcements that I can't do anything what I don't know anything about, and I want to know, so please tell me. John, do you think I really want to know? Joaquin, do you think I really want to know? Rebecca, do you think I really want to know? I really do. I really do. I really do. And so, please, do not think that you're going to... Jackie, do you think I really want to know? Christina, do you think I really want to know? I want you to feel as though you can approach me and make a biblical appeal. You say, well, I'm afraid I wouldn't do it right. I will show you how to do it right. I will walk you through it, so that if you approach me improperly, I'll say, let me stop you right there. Let me recommend that you do this instead of that. Okay? No, there's no reason to cry. I'm not telling you no. I'm telling you how. I'm telling you how. Okay? I'm telling you how. Now listen to me, Sarah. Listen to me now. But it is in my long-term best interests, and it is in the long-term best interests of this church ministry for every single one of you to know how to make a biblical appeal, not just to me, but to my successor. It's good for the ministry. It's good for you. It's good for me. It's good for whoever succeeds me. It's good for the cause of Christ. So let's do this, okay? I'm not, maybe your new pastor's going to be here sooner than we thought. I don't know, as I fall down the stairs. But yeah, it's now next week, Lord willing, I'm going to speak to you about how to approach your parent. The people that you know the best are often, far and away, the most difficult people you will ever cross paths with to make a biblical appeal. I cannot think of a human being alive on this planet today who is more difficult to make an appeal to than my dad. My goodness, difficult. I would bet that of all of the people she wants to make an appeal to, I'm probably a greater challenge to Sarah than any other human being. And I would bet the same thing is probably true with you. I know from my conversations with Jack that his mom, who's a very strong-willed woman, she's a challenge for him to deal with. And I don't think I'm violating a trust by sharing that. Sometimes our moms are strong people, okay? And they're challenging, and dads are too. My mom is not here any longer. My dad is a challenging fellow to deal with. And so all the more reason, is your mom challenging to deal with, Arhelia? Yeah? Was your mother challenging to deal with, Dolly? Was she easy? Good. So that'll be next week, Lord willing. I would like to be easy to deal with, okay? And so if anybody else have a question along this line? All right. Yes, ma'am. A Christian woman stands equal in the sight of God. No Christian woman is a subordinate auxiliary church member. No Christian woman is an auxiliary Christian. Okay? A Christian woman has a pastor. she needs to ask no one's permission to talk to her pastor. Okay? And by the way, when a Christian woman comes and talks to the pastor, the conversation will be about her issues, not anybody else's, or her children's, but not her husband's. If a husband is mentioned, he'll be mentioned in passing. Okay? So, and I believe that when Peter wrote about a Christian woman being married to a man who obeys not the gospel, that she should serve the Lord with fear. It's not fear of the husband; it's fear of God. I could spend considerable amount of time in 1 Corinthians chapter 7 pointing out that when the unbeliever departs, the only reason an unbeliever depart is if the believer is doing something he or she doesn't want them to do and they can't do anything about it. And one of those things would be to serve God. No Christian seeks or needs anyone's permission to serve God. No Christian woman has any business seeking her husband's permission to serve God. Ever. Ever. Now you should try really hard not to unnecessarily inflame him. But if it comes down to serving God or serving man, any man, even the man you're married to, sorry, yeah, we're supposed to flee idolatry. Okay? That's the reason you need to be careful who you get married to. Okay? Because nobody's got any business. We ought to obey, Peter said, we ought to obey God rather than men. And your husband, of course, unless you're a Southern California gender fluid, the person you're married to is a guy. And then you ought to obey God rather than a guy, even if the guy is your husband. Okay? No matter how he identifies today. Okay? So, I'm being a little bit humorous, but this is very, very, very serious. Very, very serious. And I know some women who it came down to it. They had to make some very, very, very serious decisions. And short-term explosion, where their life situation blew up in their face. And in the cases of some of them, we now have enough time lapse to where God has honored that person for honoring him. Others, maybe not enough time has yet taken place, but God will honor those who honor him. Okay? And you don't ask anybody's permission to serve God. Oh no, oh no. You don't ask anybody's permission to serve God because he's God. Okay. I hope, did I come across too strong? Okay. Did I come across strong enough? I hope. Anybody else have a question? But my habit is if someone wants to seek my counsel and is married to an unsaved person, 99.9% of the conversation is to that person, about that person's walk with God, that person's ministry, that person's service. Okay. And Christians, as much as lies within us, be at peace with all men, including the person you're married to. Okay, so you don't intentionally create issues. But one of the things we'll deal with next Wednesday night is this. I am really going to go after wives that undercut their husbands. I could, and Ciara's standing back there. He knows who I'm talking about before I even start. How an entire clan was destroyed, and havoc was wreaked in the family by a husband who was attempting to do right, attempting to take the right stand, and every single day when he went to work, his wife undercut him and stabbed him in the back with every one of his children. And it destroyed every single one of them because they saw their Christian mom sticking dad in the back while he was at work. So no. You the things that parents figure out or should be able to figure out right away is when a kid approaches you to make an appeal. Have you already talked to your mother? Well, if you've talked to your mother and she gave you a decision, don't come talking to me. But it ought to be worked out between husbands and wives who the ultimate authority figure in that home is supposed to be. Now, the way it was at our house is when I'm not home, it's my wife's rules. She's absolutely in charge, and however she wants to run that ship while I'm gone is fine. But as soon as I walk in the door, I'm here. My rules. And no couple has exactly the same standards for the way they raise their children. You say, well, it's confusing to the children. Excuse me, if your two kids can't figure out who's in the house, then they're retarded. Okay? Okay? And you just say, they understand, and they understand from the time they're 3 years old. Okay? Mom's rules. I'm home. Shift gears, dad's rules. Okay? I remember years ago, we were in the living room, and Sarah and I were playing catch with a ball. And the issue had never come up before. And so it wasn't like, there was, rebellion in the marriage or anything. But we're back and forth, and Sarah threw a ball, and it hit a lamp, and it went over, and I, brought it back up. And my wife walked in, and she's safely in the nursery tonight. She walked in and said, "There'll be no throwing the ball in my house." And I said, "Well, that may be when I'm not here, but I'm here now. And I like to play catch with my daughter in the living room. So that's the way it's going to be." Fuss with that if you want to, but you ain't going to win, okay? We decided before we ever got married, you ain't going to win. That's the way it is. You ain't going to win, okay? I may not be a very big dog, but I'm the biggest dog in this yard, okay? And I'm the leader. And as soon as I mentioned that to my wife, she looked at me and walked into the next room. But she never brought it up again, and she clearly understood. She clearly understood. If you do it any other way, you've got confusion reigning in your home. I think it's the simplest, most straightforward way to approach things, because for a guy to walk in from work, I'm here. Is everything okay? Nobody's sitting in my chair, are they? That's just disgusting. I just despise guys who act like that. Okay, I think a guy needs to be in charge. Okay, and if he's a wimp, he needs to be married to someone who can let a wimp be in charge. If he has to marry a woman who is so pathetic and so weak and so docile for him to be the leader, then he should marry a woman like that. I'm thankful that the women of our church, they're strong women. I like that. I like women with forceful personalities. I think it's great. I like women that know how to take charge and who will be in charge until I get home. So, how many have I offended? Have I offended you? So Tarneen goes like this. But I think your dad's in charge, isn't he? Huh? Yeah. All right. Pass your attendance slips to the nearest aisle if you would, please.